But I'm happy to welcome back to the program our very good friend. He is Father Bill Nicholas from the Archdiocese of San Francisco, up north of from where I'm sitting today. And I wanted to bring you on, Father Bill, to get your reaction now that we've had a number of days of separation from obviously Easter Sunday. And I hope you had a very blessed and happy Easter in that regard, of course, a very holy Easter. But we saw the terrible tragedy in Sri Lanka. And as we look back at what happened on that day, Christians, Catholics targeted, not Easter worshipers, whatever that means. Is there a sense of fear or worry among folks who are working as priests and as deacons and as bishops in Catholic churches because of the potential vulnerability out there now in this crazy, dangerous, fallen world we live in, Father Bill?
Well, fortunately, and thanks again for having me on, Brett. Fortunately, in this country, you don't see it as widespread as you do in other parts of the world, but there is definitely a sense of concern. Obviously, these things tend to happen on the highest holy days of the Christian faith, and especially the Catholic faith. It was just 2 years ago, I believe, in Egypt that there were the Palm Sunday bombings, and that's the Sunday just before Easter when Coptic churches, Christian churches, were bombed. But the disconcerting thing, or discouraging, unfortunate thing is, where world leaders and even the media, as you pointed out, tend to refer to it as attacks on Easter worshipers, instead of calling it what it is, which is targeted attacks on the Christian faith, and that it is definitely noticed and is often downplayed. Whenever it is brought up that these are Christians that are being targeted by various groups on their highest holy days. If it were any other minority group, it would be specifically named. The perpetrators would be specifically named and probably labeled a hate group. But for Christians, it's discouraging, but it's not something that makes them lose heart at all, because this is part of their history, and even the feast that we celebrate, Easter itself, comes 2 days after Good Friday, which we don't call Crucifixion Friday. We call it Good Friday, because Christians, while not descending into a Pollyanna approach to pretty much everything, do recognize the light shining in the darkness, and that God does in fact see his people through these times of difficulty. Not times we're looking for or that we would hope for. We certainly don't like the fact that in certain places in the world, Christians are deeply despised. But it is nonetheless a part of our history as a church from the very, very beginning.
You know, I'm glad you bring that up, because certainly last week it started terribly, right? You had a beautiful Palm Sunday, and then you have on Monday Notre Dame burning, essentially burning to the ground, but obviously a lot of it was still spared. There were some miracles there as well, and heroics that we spoke of. But you start with the burning of Notre Dame and what happened on Easter Sunday with the attacks on these churches and hotels in Sri Lanka, a country that's been racked with violence for a long time, for a lot of other reasons. But people were saying in the newspapers, they're like, well, where is God? How can this happen to us? We are being targeted. We're being slaughtered. We're being martyred here. Can you talk a little bit about that as part of the tradition of the Catholic experience, of the Christian experience since the earliest days after the resurrection of Christ, that the church would be targeted this way, and this is the cross that many people have to bear?
Oh, definitely, and even in the scriptures themselves, in the New Testament, the Acts of the Apostles, from the very first generation of Christianity, you had resentment and, in some cases, out and out persecution of the church. The Acts of the Apostles speaks of a persecution that broke out in Jerusalem that claimed the life of James, one of the apostles. You have the persecutions that took place in local communities. Thessalonica, Philippi are to name just two that are also in the Acts of the Apostles. Beyond the scriptures, you have the persecution of Nero, very well-known historical persecution, almost legendary persecution against Christians, which claimed the lives of, according to tradition, claimed the lives of Saints Paul and Saint Peter. You have the persecution of Domitian, which gave rise to the writing of the book of Revelation, the very last book of the Bible. And then, of course, there's the Great Persecution, which refers to the persecution of Domitian, which actually outlasted the emperor himself. He actually lost control of that persecution, and it outlasted his own life. And many of the saints we honor today in the Mass, and sometimes specifically named in some of the prayers, Agnes, Cecilia, Anastasia, Christopher, other saints like that, were victims of the Domitian persecution. Even my own patron saint, Saint Nicholas of Myra, from which Santa Claus, the tradition comes from, was not a martyr. He wasn't killed, but he certainly suffered during the persecution of Domitian, and at the end of it had to rebuild his church. And throughout various parts of history, especially during the missionary times, even recently a Martin Scorsese film, I believe it was called Silence, dealt with the struggles the church had in its missionary work in the Far East. Those who know the history of the French Revolution that resulted in the Great Terror, there are the Martyrs of Compagnie, which were about 15 or 16 Carmelite sisters who were guillotined because they wouldn't suppress their order according to the order of the authorities of the French Revolution. And many scholars will attribute the end of the Great Terror, the Reign of Terror, to the heroic martyrdom of the sisters of Compagnie, because the Reign of Terror came to an end just a few days after those sisters went to the guillotine. Even down to today, in Western society, you don't see so much maybe a bloody persecution, although Notre Dame, the fire, while not necessarily blamed on arson, did bring to mind for many people the vandalism and attacks on other churches throughout France and in other parts of Europe. You also see a cultural downplaying of the influence of Christianity and especially Catholicism in Western civilization, where they'll accentuate a misinterpretation or a misrepresentation of certain aspects of Catholic history. You and I have had discussions about what the Crusades were all about, because people tend to think Crusades, bad Christians. We think Inquisition is a conversation I hope you and I will eventually have on your show, and other aspects in which it is misrepresented. In fact, there's an author that I'm very, very fond of. I've read a number of his works. His name is Rodney Stark. He's a lecturer at Baylor University. He himself is a Baptist, but he's Christian. And he recently wrote a book called Bearing False Witness, subtitled Debunking Centuries of Anti-Catholic History, in which he deals with a lot of these elements of Christian and Catholic history in which the Catholicism is negatively presented. And in his introduction, he says he is not pro-Catholic, but he is pro-history. And he says it's time for the Catholic Church to get its due for its positive contributions to Western civilization and world history. But in conventional wisdom in academia, and especially in the media, you're seeing a downplaying of that and a more negative attitude toward Christianity and Catholicism, to the point where, getting back to the attacks in Sri Lanka, you see it downplayed that this was more toward Christians and more toward Easter worshipers. And unfortunately, that is a part of the trend we see today. But Christians tend not to overemphasize the victimization. Christians aren't victims in the more modern sense in which they wallow in their victimhood. They tend to look at the hope in the midst of suffering, the presence of God. And as the story goes in back to the persecution of Nero, the story goes that they were trying to help St. Peter to spirit him out of Rome to escape the persecution. And Peter had a vision of Jesus walking along the Appian Way back to Rome. And he says, "Well, Lord, where are you going?" And Jesus says to him, "I'm going to Rome to be crucified again." And there's where Peter said, "Wherever you go, Lord, I will go." And Peter turned around and went back to Rome, where he was eventually arrested and himself crucified upside down. So the idea that you were asking initially, where is God? How can they say there's a God when they're going through these sufferings? For Christians, that's proof that God is there. God is closest to his church when there is that suffering.
Great stuff from Father Bill Nicholas, and we so appreciate your insights. We will have you back on, and we will do a conversation, I promise you, about the ideas surrounding the Inquisition and the misinterpretation of that. I so appreciate you making time for us today. And I always love your wisdom and your insights. Thank you so much for coming by, and God bless you, Father Bill. We appreciate you making time for us today on this busy Wednesday.
Thanks for having me, and again, happy Easter to you.